England in the Renaissance. The Tudors, they ruled like a dynasty for most of the century, and they kinda reshaped daily life through a series of intrigues and wars and also religious upheavals. But how did Henry VII start off his reign? Well, he was the first Tudor monarch, and he came to power after the Battle of Bosworth, where he defeated Richard III. However, his claim to the throne was a bit shaky. So he went ahead and backdated his reign to 1485, the year that he actually defeated Richard III. And he used this newfound authority to seize the lands of those that he labelled traitors, including the former Duke of Buckingham and the family of Richard III. After Henry came to pretenders to the throne, first was Lambert Simnel in 1487 and then later Perkin Warbeck in the 1490s. Both failed. One of the conspirators in Lambert Simnel's attempt, however, was Sir Thomas Stanley, who later became the Earl of Derby, and he got executed for his involvement in that plot. The first Arthur, King of England, married Catherine of Aragon in 1501. He died 5 months later. So then Henry, who was originally betrothed to Arthur's sister, Mary, now became engaged to Catherine, which caused some complications because she was the previous queen. That will become important later. But before the wedding, Margaret, Henry's younger sister, married James IV of Scotland. Henry VII was very interested in making money. In fact, he micromanaged the revenue of the crown. But by 1509, when he died, England was completely solvent. During his reign, many landlords fenced off the common grazing land called the commons and shifted to raising sheep. This was called enclosure. However, the laws were weak and the villagers lost. And while Henry VII died in 1509, England was undergoing a massive urban shift. People were still working long hours, but there was more opportunity, and London was nearing 200,000 people by 1603. Now, Henry VIII started off as the ideal Renaissance prince. He had a great personality. He liked jousting. He was charismatic, but he had two major problems. First, he went to war a lot, and he didn't really gain much, except for a few months in France. Second, the great matter, he had no male heir with Catherine, and after 6 years of marriage and several miscarriages, he began to look elsewhere. Now, one of the men that Henry brought into his inner circle during this time was Thomas Cranmer, who would become Archbishop of Canterbury. Another man he brought in was Thomas Cromwell, who was an expert at getting things done. They both helped him break with Rome in 1533 and establish what was called the royal supremacy, which basically made him the head of the Church of England. Also in 1533, he married Anne Boleyn, who was in that famous painting that we talked about in our last video. They had a daughter named Elizabeth, and then Anne was executed in 1536. From 1536 onwards, he dissolved the monasteries, and many of the charity networks that had been attached to them were destroyed. There was a rebellion called the Pilgrimage of Grace in 1536, which he crushed, and he even went as far as executing one of his closest advisors, Thomas Murray, to appease the public. In 1539, he made sure that every parish had an English Bible so that the laity could read scripture. Then, he married Jane Seymour, who bore his son Edward, and then died. After that, he married Anne of Cleves, who he quickly Then, he married Catherine Howard, who he had executed. And finally, he married Catherine Parr, who outlived him. Edward VI was a minor, and he had 6 regents during his reign. Now, he was very Protestant, and things changed very rapidly. Images were ripped down and removed from churches. Chantries, which were special masses for the dead, were closed. And then, in 1549, there was a rebellion, the Prayer Book Rebellion. which was against the new prayer book that he had introduced in the West Country, and it was brutally suppressed. Also, in 1549, there was another rebellion led by a man named Ket in Norfolk. It was over enclosures, but it was also crushed. Then, in 1550, the Duke of Somerset fell and was replaced by John Dudley, the Earl of Northumberland. Northumberland pushed reforms forward rapidly, but Edward died in 1553, and all of these reforms caused a lot of resentment. Lady Jane Grey, who was a Protestant, tried to take the throne, but her bid lasted only 9 days. Then Mary, who was a Catholic, took the throne. She married Philip of Spain, who was a Catholic, and there was a rebellion in 1554, led by Sir Thomas Wyatt, to get rid of Mary. But it fizzled out. Mary went ahead and had around 300 people burned for heresy, including Archbishop Cranmer. The public backlash to this was huge, and she died in 1558 childless, which meant that her half-sister, Elizabeth I, inherited the throne. Elizabeth came to power with the mandate of restoring order and stability to England. She established what was called the middle way between the extremes of Catholicism and Protestantism. She passed the Acts of Supremacy and Uniformity, and in 1563, the 39 Articles, which was the basis for Anglicanism. She was pragmatic and focused on outward conformity rather than on zeal. She reigns in missionaries and radical Puritans. But she allowed for some leeway in worship as long as it didn't become too radical. She executed Mary, Queen of Scots, in 1587, after she was implicated in a plot to overthrow Elizabeth, and in 1588 she led the English to victory over the Spanish Armada. A combination of leadership, storms, and fireships turned the Spanish ships against each other and the English shore. She sent Sir Francis Drake to raid Spanish ports and colonies, and in 1585, Sir Walter Raleigh named the area that he explored Virginia after her. In 1587, the entire colony disappeared, and this event was called the Lost Colony of Roanoke. In 1600, she chartered the EIC, or the East India Company. Her court was frugal and trade expanded. The period between Henry VIII and Elizabeth was called the Elizabethan era, even though it started under her father, Henry VIII, because it was a flourishing time for the arts and culture. England had its greatest playwright during this time, William Shakespeare, who transformed theatre and the English language, but by the late 1590s there was strain. There was an Irish War, inflation, high taxes, and a lot of vagrancy. In 1598, she passed the Poor Law, which organized relief for the poor. She died in 1603, and the Tudor era ended.